The wind carried the bite of early winter across the dusty trail as she stumbled along the worn road, her thin dress clinging to her frame and her cracked lips whispering silent prayers for strength. Hunger had gnawed at her belly for days each step an effort that reminded her of how little she had left in this world. Her shoes had holes worn through the soles, her hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, and her heart ached with the weight of memories she could no longer bear to think of. A once vibrant life with laughter and family had been stripped away by sickness and hardship until she was nothing more than a wandering shadow searching for a place where she might survive. At the edge of town she paused, watching wagons rattle past and townsfolk go about their business with suspicious eyes cast in her direction. She was used to the looks of pity, mixed with disdain, and though she tried to hold her head high, shame pressed her shoulders low. She knew they whispered behind her back that she was too young to be alone, too ragged to be trusted, too desperate to be safe. She ignored them and turned away from the crowded main street, heading instead toward the rolling land where fences stretched against the horizon and smoke curled from the chimneys of ranch houses. That was when she saw it. The largest ranch she had ever laid eyes upon sat proudly on the rise, its wide pastures filled with grazing cattle, its barns painted in fading red, and its homestead standing sturdy against the harshness of the prairie. The sight should have filled her with hope, but instead it made her heart pound harder because she knew the risk she was about to take. To knock upon the door of a stranger and ask for food was humiliating enough, but she had nothing else to offer except herself, and in that thought she found both her terror and her resolve. She had heard of the Pierre man who owned the ranch, a widower, they said, a hard and quiet fellow who kept to himself and demanded respect. Some said he was cold, others swore he had a fair heart, but she knew only that he was her last chance. She crossed the yard with trembling legs, her eyes catching on the strong rails of the corral and the horses lifting their heads to watch her. A dog barked sharply, and the sound nearly sent her running, but before she could turn back the door opened, and there he stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and steady, with eyes the color of storm clouds that studied her without a word. His face bore lines carved by sun and sorrow, and though his expression was stern, it was not unkind. For a moment she forgot how to speak and simply stood there, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the world. Then the words tumbled from her lips, broken and low. I have nothing. I can give you nothing except myself. If you let me stay, if you give me food and a place to sleep, I will work, I will do anything you ask, but please, sir, do not send me away. Silence stretched between them, long enough for shame to burn hot in her cheeks. She expected anger or laughter, perhaps even scorn, but none came. Instead, he stepped aside and in a voice low and steady said, "Come in." She hesitated, unable to understand such simple mercy. Was this pity? Was it duty? She did not know, but the scent of warm stew drifted from the house and her empty stomach answered for her. She stepped inside the cabin, her knees weak with relief. The room was plain yet clean, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. His eyes followed her as he closed the door, and she could not tell what he saw in her thin frame and hollow cheeks, but he did not reach for her or demand anything of her. He simply set a bowl of food on the table and said, "Eat." She sat down with tears stinging her eyes, lifting the spoon with shaking hands. It was the first kindness she had been shown in a very long time, and though she had come prepared to trade her dignity for survival, the rancher had given her something far more valuable. In that moment, a chance to live another day without surrendering her soul, and as she ate she wondered if perhaps this place would become more than just a shelter from the storm. The morning light filtered through the cabin window, casting soft gold across the wooden floor as she stirred awake on the small cot he had given her. The blankets, though worn, smelled faintly of cedar and warmth, and for the first time in weeks she had slept without fear of waking cold and hungry. Yet as her eyes blinked open and the quiet of the ranch filled her ears, she felt the weight of shame settle heavily upon her chest. She remembered the words she had spoken at his door, the bargain She had offered herself in exchange for food and shelter, and though he had accepted her presence without demanding such a price, she could not push aside the thought that he might change his mind any moment. She rose quickly, smoothing the blanket, and twisting her hair back from her face, determined not to appear ungrateful. The scent of coffee lingered from the kitchen, where he sat at the table, already dressed for the day, his eyes lifted to hers, steady as ever, unreadable, yet not harsh. He nodded toward the chair opposite him. "Sit, eat." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as though her presence were no burden at all, but still she hesitated, unsure if she belonged at the same table as him. He did not press, only pushed a plate of bread and eggs a little closer and returned to his cup. She sat slowly, her hands trembling as she lifted the fork. Each bite tasted like a gift, and she forced herself not to devour it too quickly, lest she appear the starving stray. She feared they all saw her, as after breakfast he gave her small tasks to do, things she could manage despite her frailness. Sweep the porch, gather kindling, feed the chickens. Simple chores that kept her hands busy and her thoughts distracted. She moved about the ranch, timidly at first, aware of the eyes of the ranch hands who paused in their work to glance at her. Some smirked, whispering low, while others simply frowned as though questioning why she was there. Their looks cut into her pride, yet she bit her tongue and carried on, knowing she had no right to complain. The rancher said little throughout the day, but his presence loomed steady and watchful. He worked among the men, repairing fences, hauling supplies, tending to the horses, and though he did not speak of it, she sensed he kept an ear open for trouble. Every time a whisper rose too loud or a stare lingered too long, he silenced it with a single look. She did not know what it meant to him to have her here, but she began to suspect that, though he was stern, he would not allow cruelty under his roof. That evening, as she cleared dishes from the table, she found herself glancing toward him again and again, trying to read the quiet in his expression. He never spoke of her bargain, never demanded repayment, never even hinted at why he had let her stay. The silence of it unsettled her more than if he had asked for the very thing she had offered, because she could not understand kindness given freely. She lay awake that night, listening to the tin-tida creak of the timbers and the whistle of wind outside, wondering what sort of man he was. Was he simply biding his time until he cast her out? Was this some test of endurance, or did he truly mean to let her remain as she was a guest in his home, not a servant, not a prize, but simply a soul in need? Days turned into weeks, and though her shame never fully left her, she began to settle into the rhythm of life. There she found comfort in small things, the way the chickens clucked softly when she scattered feed, the steady warmth of the fire at dusk, the quiet nod of the rancher each evening as though acknowledging her efforts. She still felt the weight of the whispers from townfolk who eyed her suspiciously when she walked into the general store, but she clung to the fragile sense of safety that his ranch gave her. One afternoon, as she hung laundry in the crisp breeze, she caught sight of him standing near the corral, his broad figure silhouetted against the fading sun. For a fleeting moment she thought she saw something softer in his gaze, something that made her heart stumble, though he looked away before she could be sure. She shook her head, chiding herself for the foolish thought. He had taken her in out of duty, nothing more. Yet as she folded the clean linens and returned inside, she realized that despite her fears, despite her shame, a tiny seed of hope had begun to root within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was more than a bargain to him. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm, marked by the rising sun over the pastures and the steady hum of work that filled the ranch. She woke each morning before the men to stoke the fire and prepare coffee, and though her hands were still thin, and her body fragile, strength slowly returned to her limbs with each passing day. Her chores became more than simple tasks. They became her way of proving that she belonged here. Every sweep of the broom, every meal she cooked, every pail of water she carried was done with care, not only because she was grateful, but because she feared the day he might decide she had not done enough. She wanted him to see that she was worth keeping. It was during one cold morning that she found the calf shivering in the corner of the barn, its leg twisted from a fall. The ranch hands muttered that it would not survive, but she knelt beside it, her hands gentle and her voice low, coaxing it to drink the warm milk she had fetched. She tended to it for hours each day, binding its leg, feeding its soft hay, stroking its muzzle until the animal grew strong enough to stand on its own. The men who once smirked at her began to look at her with a kind of quiet respect, and though none said it aloud, she felt the shift in their glances. The rancher himself stood in the doorway one evening watching her work with the calf, his face unreadable, but his eyes softened by something she could not name. He said nothing, only gave a slight nod before turning back to his duties, yet that small gesture warmed her more than the fire at her hearth. As weeks folded into months, the silence between her and the rancher began to change. It was not cold silence, not the kind that shut her out, but the kind that gave her space to breathe. She grew accustomed to his quiet presence, the way he moved through the house steady and sure, the way his voice, though sparse, carried weight when he spoke at night. She often found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch or the scrape of his chair at the table, just to know he was near. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending a torn shirt, he returned from the pastures, his shoulders heavy with the weariness of the day. She looked up to find his gaze fixed on her, not in judgment, but in something gentler, as if he were trying to understand her as much as she tried to understand him. For a moment she froze, needle in hand, heart hammering, until he spoke quietly. "You work hard. You've earned your place here." The words, simple as they were, cut through the layers of fear that had wrapped around her heart. She lowered her eyes, unable to keep the tears from welling, though she fought them back. He had given her more in that single moment than she had dared to hope. But it was not only his words that revealed his thoughts, it was the small acts too. When he noticed her shivering on a cold morning, he left a heavier coat draped over the chair without comment. When her hands blistered from chopping wood, he sharpened the axe himself and showed her how to hold it properly. When the gossip in town turned cruel, whispering about the young woman who lived under his roof, he met their stares with such cold defiance that no one dared say a word aloud. She could not fathom why he shielded her from such things, why he allowed her to stay when he could have dismissed her without explanation. Yet each day that passed deepened her sense that she was no longer merely surviving, she was beginning to live again. Still, the old fear clung to her like a shadow. One night, as the fire flickered low, she found herself crumbling under the weight of it. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered into the emptiness that she knew he would cast her out when spring came, that she was nothing but a burden taking up space in his home. She did not realize he stood in the doorway listening until he stepped forward, his boots creaking softly against the wood. His voice, though firm, was low enough to soothe. "You belong here." Do not doubt that she looked up at him, startled by the certainty in his tone. Her lips parted to argue, but the words died on her tongue. His gaze held hers steady and unwavering until something inside her began to shift. For the first time since she had knocked on his door, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not a temporary guest, but someone who truly had a place here. In the silence that followed, she felt the bond between them no longer forged in necessity, but in something far stronger, something unspoken yet undeniable. The thaw of spring brought with it both warmth and whispers. The cattle grazed freely in the greening pastures. The air was thick with the scent of earth and wildflowers, and yet the town buzzed with talk that traveled faster than the wind. Each time she walked into the general store to buy flour or coffee, she could feel the stares pressing against her back. She heard the low voices, the women muttering that she was shameless for living under his roof without a ring, the men suggesting with crude laughter that her presence there was anything but decent. She kept her eyes lowered, her shoulders hunched, but the words cut all the same, like tiny knives, leaving wounds no one could see. She tried to hide it from him, tried to keep her head down and go about her chores, but he was not a man easily fooled. He noticed the way her hands trembled as she kneaded bread, how her eyes dimmed when she returned from town. He said nothing at first, only watched with that steady gaze of his, the one that made her feel both exposed and protected all at once. But one evening after supper, when the sun bled red across the horizon, He set down his fork and studied her with a quiet intensity. She fidgeted beneath the weight of it, afraid of what he might say, until finally he spoke. "You've heard them, haven't you?" She froze, unable to deny it. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw set hard. "I won't. Have their poison hurting you?" His voice carried a finality that startled her, as though he had already made a decision she did not yet understand. The next day he rode into town alone while she stayed behind, her heart restless with dread. When he returned, his eyes carried a fire she had never seen before, and in his hand was a small velvet pouch worn from travel. He said nothing until after supper, when the ranch hands had left and the house lay in quiet shadows. He placed the pouch on the table between them, and for a long moment only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. She looked at it, puzzled, then back at him, but his gaze was steady, unwavering. He reached inside and drew out a simple gold band, its surface plain, yet gleaming in the firelight. Her breath caught her throat tight with disbelief. "I won't have them." "Speaking of you that way," he said, his voice low and sure. "But more than that, I won't have you thinking you're anything less than worthy of respect. You came here broken, starving, ready to trade your dignity just to survive, but you've given this place more than you know. You've given it life again, and you've given me something I thought I'd buried a long time ago." Hope. His words struck her deeper than any kindness she had ever known. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely as she shook her head. "No, I am not worthy of this. I have nothing. I am nothing." His eyes softened, but his tone grew firm. "Don't you ever say that again. You are not nothing. You are everything." He stood then, coming around the table to kneel before her, holding the ring in his calloused hand. He did not speak flowery promises nor make grand gestures. His words were simple, true. "Will you marry me? Not because you owe me, not because you need shelter, but because I want you by my side as my wife." Her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might shatter through her chest. She wanted to refuse, not because she didn't long for it, but because the fear of failing him, the fear of being unworthy, still clawed at her. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she saw no doubt, only steady devotion that left no room for her own. She nodded slowly, her voice a trembling whisper, "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand warm and steady against hers. The band, though plain, gleamed brighter than any jewel she could have imagined. She sobbed softly as he drew her into his arms, holding her close, not as a bargain, not as a stray taken in, but as his equal, his chosen. She felt in that embrace a belonging stronger than any roof or meal could provide. The walls of the ranch no longer felt like shelter, they felt like home, and though the town would surely continue to whisper, she knew their voices could never again drown out the truth of what had just been spoken. She was no longer a woman trading herself for survival. She was a wife cherished and chosen by a man who had seen her worth even when she could not. The wedding was quiet, with only the ranch hands standing as witnesses and the preacher from town speaking the solemn words that bound them together. Yet, despite its simplicity, it felt to her like the grandest ceremony in the world for the moment. He slipped that plain gold ring back onto her finger. Before God and man, she knew she had been given something far greater than she had ever dared dream. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and though little outwardly changed, the very air within those walls felt warmer, brighter, safer. She was no longer a guest in his home, no longer a stray taken in by mercy. She was his wife, and with that came a new strength that surprised her. Life on the ranch soon fell into a new rhythm shared between them. He still rose before dawn to tend to the cattle, but now she rose with him, preparing coffee and bread while he strapped on his boots and hat. They shared quiet moments in the early glow of morning, her laughter soft when he teased her for worrying too much over his breakfast, his smile rare but genuine when she met him at the door with a kiss before he set out to the fields. She had once been afraid to even look him in the eye, yet now she found comfort in the steadiness of his presence, their silence no longer heavy with doubt but filled with unspoken understanding. Not long after the wedding he surprised her with a hammer in his hand and wood piled high beside the house. She stood puzzled as he marked out beams and measured the earth until she realized what he was building, a room for you, he explained, his voice matter of fact, but his eyes softened with meaning, a place of your own, a space that's yours alone. She felt her throat tighten with emotion, for no one had ever given her such a gift, not even her parents when she was a girl. A room built by his hands just for her spoke louder than any words of love could. Day by day the room took shape under his skilled hands. She helped where she could, holding boards, steady carrying nails, or fetching water from the well while he worked into the evening, sweat glistening on his brow. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly for spending his time building instead of riding fence, but she could see in their smiles that they respected him more for it. She stitched curtains out of scraps of fabric she had saved, sewing them by the firelight with care, dreaming of how they would hang in the window. She found wildflowers blooming near the creek and planted them along the side of the new wall, envisioning their blossoms brightening the doorway come summer. He built sturdy shelves into the corner, a wide window that looked out over the pasture, and even a rocking chair smooth as polished stone for her to sit in when the day's work was done. Their marriage grew in those small moments, laughter shared over a meal, tools passed hand to hand, long evenings by the fire where she leaned against him as he read quietly from an old worn Bible. She felt herself blooming like the very flowers she had planted, no longer the thin, hollow girl who had come begging for food, but a woman filled with purpose and love. The shadows of shame that had once haunted her steps lifted little by little until she could meet the eyes of others without fear. Still, there were challenges. Ranch life was never easy. Storms rolled across the plains, bringing fierce winds that tore at the fences, and once a calf nearly drowned in the rising creek, but they faced it together, side by side, and each trial only bound them tighter. She discovered a quiet strength in herself she had not known existed, and he discovered laughter again, the sound of it rumbling low in his chest when she teased him or tripped clumsily over her own hem. They were not grand people with riches or finery, but in the simple work of their hands and the honesty of their love they found wealth enough. One evening, as he finished placing the final boards and the room stood nearly complete, she stepped inside and turned slowly, taking in the walls, the shelves, the broad window glowing with sunset light. Her hand trailed along the Mahdi Hamdana smooth wood, her heart swelling with wonder. "You built this for me," she whispered, half in disbelief. He set down his tools and wiped his brow, his gaze steady on hers. "I built it for us, for the life we're making together." In that moment she felt tears blur her vision, but they were not the tears of shame she had once shed. They were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love so deep it frightened and healed her all at once. She had once thought survival was the best she could hope for, but now she saw that life held more. A husband who cherished her, a home built with care, and a future bright with promise. The day the room was finished dawned clear and bright, with the scent of grass heavy in the air and the sound of cattle lowing across the fields. She had risen early to prepare breakfast, but he had already left the table bare, a note scrawled in his rough hand telling her to wait until evening. Her heart beat fast with curiosity all day long as she went about her chores, her mind returning again and again to the hammering sounds drifting from the side of the house. She tried not to peek, though her fingers itched to lift the curtain and steal a glance. Instead, she busied herself with the hens and the garden, telling herself to be patient. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in pink and gold, he appeared at the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the light and a rare smile tugging at his mouth. "Come with me," he said. Her feet carried her quickly across the yard, her skirts brushing the fresh flowers she had planted weeks ago, and her breath caught when he opened the door to the new room. The glow of evening poured in through the wide window, casting long beams across polished wood. The shelves he had built were sturdy and waiting to be filled. The rocking chair stood near the hearth, smooth and shining. The curtains she had sewn hung neatly, swaying in the breeze. It was a simple space, yet it looked to her like a palace, for every board, every nail, every stroke of his hand was a promise made solid before her eyes. She stood frozen, her lips Trembling, her eyes brimming with tears, he watched her silently for a moment, then stepped behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. His voice, low and certain, rumbled in her ear. "This is yours, a place where no one can ever put you out. Again, a place that says you belong." She turned to him, her tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She remembered the night she had arrived, thin and desperate, trembling at his door with nothing but a broken bargain on her lips, and she looked now at the room before her, at the ring on her hand, at the man who had given her all of it, and she could hardly believe it was the same life. Her knees weakened under the weight of emotion, but he steadied her with strong arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, and carrying her across the threshold. She gasped at the gesture, her hands gripping his shoulders. He chuckled softly, the sound rare but warm. "Like a bride," he said, "even though we've been married a while already." She laughed through her tears, leaning her head against his chest as he set her gently down in the rocking chair. He knelt before her, much as he had the night he proposed, his eyes steady and sure. "I built this room with my hands, but it's your heart that turned this house into a home." She reached out, brushing her fingers against his cheek, her voice trembling with love. "You've given me more than I ever asked, more than I ever thought I deserved." The days that followed were filled with new joy. She arranged the shelves with the few books he owned, folded her quilts neatly into the chest by the bed, and planted herbs just outside the window, so their scent drifted in on warm afternoons. Every detail felt sacred, not because of the objects themselves, but because of the love that had built them. Together they sat in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the hills, her head resting on his shoulder as the fire crackled softly. The ranch was no longer a place of survival, but of belonging, a sanctuary, built not just of wood and stone, but of devotion and trust. Word of their marriage spread through town, and though the whispers lingered, they no longer pierced her heart. She walked proudly at his side, her head high, her hand in his, because she knew the truth of who she was: not a beggar, not a bargain, but a wife loved deeply and openly. The people could gossip all they wished, but they could not take from her the peace she had found, nor the certainty that she would never again face the world. Alone one evening, as spring gave way to summer, she stood at the window of her new room, watching the cattle graze beneath the fading light. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. She leaned into him, her heart full, remembering the girl she had been when she arrived hungry and lost. She had traded herself once for food and shelter, but what she had been given instead was beyond measure: a wedding ring that bound her to a man of honor, a room filled with sunlight and warmth, and a love stronger than any storm that might come across the prairie. And as the stars blossomed across the night sky, she knew without doubt that she was finally home.